James watched with growing discomfort as Storm, his typically gentle German shepherd, once again took his place beside the baby's crib. As the night fell over the family's humble home, the same pattern repeated itself, just as it had every night for the past 2 weeks. Storm's ears would suddenly perk up, his posture would stiffen, and a deep, steady growl would rumble from his chest. "I don't understand this," James murmured to his wife, Margaret, who was leaning against the nursery door. Storm had been a beloved member of the family for 5 years, ever since they brought him home from the shelter. He had always been remarkably kind, especially to the neighborhood children, who eagerly stopped to pet him during their evening walks. When they brought baby Oliver home from the hospital 3 months ago, Storm had been nothing but protective and gentle. He used to lie quietly beside the crib during afternoon naps, his tail wagging softly whenever Oliver made a sound. But something changed 2 weeks ago. Now, every night, like clockwork, Storm stood guard and growled. The spring nights were getting warmer, and James checked the nursery carefully each night. The windows were tightly shut, the screens intact, and there were no signs of unwelcome visitors, like rats or squirrels. Storm's behavior persisted, always focused on the same corner of the room, even when Oliver slept peacefully. Margaret suggested taking Storm to the vet for a checkup, wondering if he might be feeling discomfort or anxiety, which could explain his behavior. The exam revealed nothing unusual. Storm was in perfect health for a dog of his age. The vet explained that dogs sometimes react to changes in the environment that humans can't detect, like subtle sounds or changes in air pressure. James spent hours observing Storm, noticing that the dog's growl wasn't aggressive or threatening. It seemed more like a warning, similar to how he acted when hearing unusual noises outside. Storm had never shown any aggression toward Oliver. In fact, he positioned himself as though trying to protect the baby from something in that corner of the room. "Maybe we should have someone check the house," suggested Margaret. One night, after another episode of Storm's strange behavior, Margaret, with a thoughtful voice, remembered last fall when the dog couldn't stop scratching the kitchen wall. They discovered a leaking pipe inside. She was right. Storm's instincts had proven reliable before, which made James pay even closer attention. The next morning, while changing Oliver's diaper, James noticed something that made him stop. He felt a faint draft near the corner where Storm always focused his attention. It was almost imperceptible, but enough to make the baby's mobile spin slightly. Could this be what was bothering Storm? Dogs like him were known to be sensitive to such things, and with his sharp hearing, he could detect sounds far beyond human perception. That night, as James was getting ready for bed, he watched Storm remain in his vigilant position by the crib. He made a decision. The next morning, he would call a home inspector to carefully examine the nursery. Something was clearly wrong, and if Storm was trying to warn them, James was determined to find out what it was. He reached out and petted Storm's head, receiving a brief wag of the tail in response, though the dog's eyes never left that corner. "Good boy," James whispered, grateful for his loyal companion's dedication to protecting his family. Whatever was causing Storm's concern, they would get to the bottom of it, not just for their peace of mind, but for Oliver's safety and Storm's comfort as well. The mystery would soon be solved, but for tonight, James found comfort in knowing his faithful guardian was watching over his son with unwavering devotion. The next morning, James wasted no time and called the home inspection service as soon as they opened. The soonest available appointment was in 3 days, which felt terribly long given Storm's persistent behavior. Margaret suggested moving Oliver's crib to their room for the time being, but James hesitated, worried that it might just hide any problem Storm was desperately trying to warn them about. Throughout the day, Storm followed a peculiar pattern that James hadn't noticed before. In the morning, the dog seemed perfectly relaxed in the nursery, often napping in the sunlight that streamed through the window. However, as the afternoon approached, his behavior gradually changed. Around 4 p.m., Storm began walking back and forth between the nursery door and that mysterious corner, his anxiety increasing as nightfall neared. James worked from home that day, organizing his paperwork at a small desk near the nursery. He kept detailed notes on Storm's behavior, hoping to identify any triggers. The pattern he had noticed before seemed stronger at certain times, especially when the afternoon sun warmed the outside wall. Being an old house, James thought there might be structural issues that became more noticeable with temperature changes. Margaret returned from her teaching job at the usual time, carrying a small notebook with questions for the home inspector. She had also spoken to her elderly neighbor, Margaret, who had lived in the house next door for 40 years. The neighbor mentioned that during the last big storm, she had noticed water stains on the wall behind Oliver's crib. That night, as the storm took its usual place by the crib, James brought a ladder to examine the corner more closely. The dog watched intently but didn't move from his spot. Using a flashlight, James began investigating the area more carefully. James found thin cracks in the paint on the ceiling, spreading like a web from the corner. When he pressed his hand against the wall, he could feel a slight vibration, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. Oliver slept peacefully the whole time, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. The mobile above the crib lazily spun in the draft, creating shifting shadows on the walls. James noticed that Storm's eyes followed those shadows, but his attention always returned to that corner. His growl deepened whenever the vibration seemed to intensify. Margaret spent the night thinking of possible explanations while looking at her tablet. In a low voice, she shared her thoughts with James. It could be anything, a loose pipe, structural settling, or even something electrical, she murmured. But what really worries me is why Storm only reacts at night. There must be something that changes when the house cools after sunset. They decided to take turns staying awake to monitor the situation. During James's watch, around midnight, he noticed something strange. The faint draft became more pronounced, and with it came a soft sound. It wasn't exactly a whistle, but a subtle, quick noise that seemed to come from inside the wall. Storm's ears twitched with each new sound. His growl maintained its protective tone. James picked up Oliver and held him close as he walked the perimeter of the room. When he approached the corner, Storm stood and moved with them, positioning himself between them and the wall. The dog's behavior wasn't aggressive. On the contrary, it seemed more protective than ever, determined to stay between his family and whatever might be behind that wall. As James gently placed Oliver back in his crib, a wave of gratitude washed over him for Storm's unwavering vigilance. Dogs had instincts and senses far beyond human understanding, and it was clear that Storm was trying to alert them to something significant. The visit from the home inspector couldn't come soon enough, but for now, James found comfort in knowing his loyal companion was standing guard. Storm's devotion to protecting Oliver was steadfast, a silent reassurance that they weren't facing this mystery alone. That night, when James finally went to bed, he left Storm in his post. James couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to discover something significant. Whatever it was, he was grateful Storm had alerted them before it became a serious problem. Sometimes, James reflected, it took an animal's instincts to reveal what human senses might miss. The home inspector arrived promptly on Thursday morning. His keen eyes immediately noticed Storm's tense and vigilant posture in the nursery. "Dogs are usually better than any tool we use," he commented while setting up his equipment. "They can pick up things our instruments might miss, like the sound of water running through a pipe or wood stretching under pressure." James explained Storm's behavior pattern while Margaret held Oliver close. The inspector listened carefully, nodding as he began his examination. He started with basic measurements, checking the walls for sagging and the floor for leveling. When he reached the corner that concerned Storm, the level showed a slight but noticeable tilt. "This is interesting," thought the inspector, pressing his hand against the wall. He took a moisture meter and ran it along the surface. The device's reading jumped significantly near the area Storm was watching. "Definitely high moisture in this section," he confirmed. "Look here," he pointed his flashlight at the baseboards, revealing a nearly invisible dark line. Storm stayed close throughout the inspection, his eyes never leaving the corner. When the inspector tapped the wall, the dog's ears perked forward, and a low whine escaped his throat. The sound was different from his usual nighttime growls, more urgent, as if confirming that someone else had finally noticed what he had been trying to tell them. The inspection continued meticulously, each step revealing more concerning discoveries. "Sorry for the interruption, but before we continue, I kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It's very important to us. Thank you so much." The inspector identified significant water damage to the exterior brick, pointing to a defective gutter as the likely culprit. Instead of draining during heavy rains, water had been infiltrating the wall cavity, slowly compromising the structure. "The vibrations you noticed," he explained, "are probably caused by water moving through weakened materials, like loose bricks or deteriorating wood." It was clear the problem had been developing for some time, and immediate repairs would be necessary to prevent further damage. The issue is growing because of the unusually wet spring, the inspector explained. During the day, the sun warms the wall, causing moisture to evaporate and rise. But at night, as temperatures drop, the moisture condenses and flows back down. This repeated movement is probably what your dog is detecting. It's subtle, but their hearing is much more sensitive than ours. Margaret hugged Oliver tighter, her face showing relief at having an explanation, but also concern about the implications. The inspector continued his assessment, taking photos and making careful notes. He discovered that the problem had spread to the crawl space below, where moisture was beginning to affect the support structures. If this had gone unnoticed for a few more months, you could have faced significant structural problems, he warned solemnly. The water damage would have continued spreading, potentially threatening the stability of this entire corner of the house. Your dog probably saved you from a much bigger issue. The inspector said this with a nod of respect. James reached out and petted Storm, who finally relaxed a little now that the others were acknowledging the threat he had detected. The inspector recommended immediate repairs, emphasizing that while the situation was serious, it could be fully resolved with proper attention. He provided a detailed report and referred them to several reputable contractors who could fix both the external water issues and internal damage. That night, while waiting for the contractors' estimates, Storm remained vigilantly by Oliver's crib, but there was a change in his behavior. His growls were softer, almost as if he knew help was finally on the way. James and Margaret moved Oliver's crib to their room temporarily, following the inspector's advice, until repairs could be completed. As James watched Storm adjust to the new sleeping arrangement, following them into the room with one last look at the nursery corner, he felt an overwhelming gratitude for his dog's persistence. Storm had detected a serious problem weeks before any human had noticed, and his protective instincts had likely prevented a dangerous situation from unfolding. The contractor began work the following week, and what they discovered made James's heart race. Upon opening the wall, they found that the water damage was far more extensive than the initial inspection had revealed. The wooden support beam that ran through that corner was significantly rotted, and parts of the wall cavity were filled with mold. The contractor explained that the vibrations Storm had been hearing were probably caused by the compromised beam moving under the weight of the house. "Your dog wasn't just warning about the water," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "That beam could have given way without warning. These old houses sometimes hide their problems until it's too late." James watched as the workers carefully documented the damage, thinking of how many nights Storm had stayed on guard, sensing the danger hidden behind that wall. Margaret took time off from teaching to supervise the repairs while James worked. She noticed how Storm's behavior changed as the work progressed. Instead of his usual anxious nighttime growl, he now watched the contractors, following them closely as they replaced the damaged materials. The workers became fond of the four-legged supervisor, amazed at how he perked up whenever they approached the previously problematic corner. The local vet, who had initially examined Storm during their concerns, stopped by to check on the dog. She explained that dogs can detect vibrations and subtle sounds at frequencies far beyond human hearing. Storm wasn't just picking up the sound of the water or the creaking wood, she clarified. He was probably sensing the overall instability of the structure itself. Dogs have an extraordinary ability to notice when something in their surroundings feels off. As repairs continued, James and Margaret found out that several other houses in their neighborhood had similar problems, although none had been detected as early as theirs. Their neighbor had her house inspected after hearing about their experience and found similar water damage starting in her walls. The contractor explained that unusual weather patterns had affected many houses in the area. One night, James watched the sunset through the plastic tarp temporarily covering the nursery wall. He noticed that Storm was acting differently. Instead of his usual alert posture and growl, the dog was calmly lying in his bed, watching the workers clean up for the day. The visible relief in Storm's behavior confirmed what James suspected. His loyal companion had finally realized the danger was passing. The repairs took 2 weeks to complete, during which Oliver continued to sleep in his parents' room. He adjusted to the temporary situation, though he still made regular checks on the nursery, inspecting the contractor's progress with what seemed to be approval. The workers joked that Storm was their most attentive quality control inspector. James often shared his story with other parents at the park, highlighting the value of observing their pets' behavior. "Animals notice things beyond our awareness," he would say, while Storm gently played with Dan on their picnic blanket. "What seems like strange behavior might not be strange at all." They're trying to communicate something important. The community veterinary clinic even asked James to share his experience in a workshop for pet owners, using Storm's story to illustrate how animals often detect household dangers before humans do. Margaret put together a simple presentation, including photos of the wall damage and Storm's vigilant behavior, helping other families understand the importance of taking their pets' warnings seriously. As the repairs neared completion, James reflected on how close they came to a potential disaster if Storm hadn't been so persistent in his warnings. If they had dismissed his behavior as simple jealousy or anxiety, the outcome could have been very different. The contractor assured them that the new support beam and waterproofing measures would prevent similar problems in the future. Storm was showered with praise and given extra treats during this period, though his greatest satisfaction seemed to come from quietly keeping an eye on Oliver during his daily activities. The nighttime growls had completely stopped, replaced by calm, restful naps near the newly repaired wall. James often found himself stopping at the nursery door, grateful for the bond between his son and his perceptive protector. Finally, the day came to move the crib back into the room, now fully repaired. The walls were repainted in the same soft yellow, the window frames were freshly sealed, and new baseboards were installed. The contractor added extra waterproofing to the exterior walls and updated the gutter system to prevent any future water infiltration. Most importantly, the dangerous rotten beam was replaced with a new, sturdy support. James and Margaret nervously watched as Storm entered the restored room, both wondering how he would react. The dog followed his usual patrol route, carefully working along the baseboards and paying special attention to the corner that had worried him for so many weeks. After a thorough inspection, Storm contentedly lay down in his favorite spot by the window, offering no growls or signs of distress. His composed behavior gave them the reassurance they had been seeking. That night, when they placed Oliver in his crib for the first time in weeks, the change was extraordinary. The room felt solid and safe, with no sign of the draft that once made the baby's mobile sway. Storm took his usual position by the crib, but instead of staying alert and growling, he peacefully napped, occasionally lifting his head to check on Oliver before settling back down. Did you enjoy this story? What do you think about the bond between dogs and children? Can it exist, or is it too risky to leave them together? Let us know in the comments below. If you liked the story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like.